In 2011, Dr. Judith Hand, evolutionary biologist and behaviorist, taped this inspiring speech with a small group in La Jolla, California. She continues to deliver its hopeful message in the United States and abroad.
I'm going to speak about this profoundly important topic of war and the human potential for peace, and I have roughly 55 minutes, which is a big challenge. You know, what do I leave out and have things still make sense to you? My goal is to provoke thinking. And so I've chosen to present an outline of a few key issues, and I have to caution you that of necessity I'm speaking in broad strokes and generalizations. What I've done is distill major principles into a few sentences. So you're going to have questions, maybe even disagreements. And I urge you to take note of your questions, and when at the conclusion I will attempt to answer them. And that allows me to address what's of interest to you. I want us to be on the cutting edge of a great paradigm shift, a potential paradigm shift, one of the greatest in history, the abolition of war. And to get you fired up for that challenge, how I need to explain why striving to reach that goal is not a waste of time, why it is actually possible. So I'm going to get right to it here, and to paraphrase the Apollo 13 astronauts, humanity, we have a problem. Our species, as you all know, is at a profoundly serious social and ecological tipping point. And one reason why is that, as the ecological economist Herman Daly has said, the planet is full. We used to be able to migrate to new lands when resources ran out or when there was too much fighting going on. And what Daly means by full is that all of the readily habitable places for us, with water and essential resources, they're all populated. So we face seemingly endless wars with nowhere to flee. We face the possibility of some paranoid leader actually unleashing nuclear weapons, or some country by mistake releasing a globally fatal weapon of mass destruction, chemical or biological. And then there is global climate change, whatever its cause. The predictions are that we're in for more frequent and stronger hurricanes, longer droughts, torrential rains, and snowstorms that dump huge amounts of snow. You all know that the Arctic ice cap is melting. This was probably photoshopped, but it's very symbolic. So are many glaciers and the Antarctic cap, and the released water threatens to flood some entire countries and wipe out major coastlines. And what that means is we're likely to have massive refugee problems. Some argue that this is already happening in some places. The potential perils that lie ahead of us could keep us at each other's throats for generations. So what's the point? The biogeographer Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse, chronicled great societies before ours that undoubtedly thought that they would last forever. And I hope that you're going to see this talk as about more than just the potential for peace, but also about how we might be able to save ourselves from ourselves. And now, I'm not a historian, and I'm not from a faith community, and I'm not even a peace activist. I am an evolutionary biologist and a behaviorist. My areas of specialization are communication, conflict resolution, and gender differences. So what I'm sharing with you is what I believe and know from the it's what I believe and know from the perspective of a scientist. So now consider figures on the left graphed for the world's top 5 military spenders in billions of dollars for just 1 year, 2009. Note the USA expenditures compared to the other top 4. The top 10 military spenders lavished well over $1 trillion in that year. And if we considered the world's total military budgets in 2009, it would be staggering. To survive the many challenges we have, we need resources, and that includes money. So it doesn't take a scientist to figure out that money spent on wars is an insane waste. So what we're here today is to consider whether there is any reason to think that we could shape a future without war, which would free up this money. And right away we need to agree on definitions. Murder is not war. What they call revenge killings, that is individual redress against other people for specific disagreements, is also not war. War is people organizing and arming themselves to indiscriminately kill people in another group. So we're not concerned here with murder or revenge killings. What we're asking about is, why do we make war, and could we end it? I think of our love affair with war as like having a relationship with a really vicious, brutal partner. And my work is to convince people that we actually can end this relationship if we really want to. Here's the topics I'm going to cover, looking at how they relate to the potential for peace. First, the origins of cooperation, altruism, and empathy. Then the origins of a sense of fairness and morality. The possible origins of war. Gender differences in the use of aggression to resolve conflicts. Reasons why we can embrace the goal of ending war with confidence. A simple introduction to the kinds of efforts it would take to abolish war. And finally, how the potential for peace relates to each of us personally. Our destiny, our choice, our future. Now, I want to do something real quickly that I've done for years before every talk on the subject of war. It's a little audience survey. Just in your own mind, please, answer this question. Based on your life experiences so far, your knowledge, do you think it's possible that humans can create a future without war? And that is not the question, would you like us to do it? It's, do you think it's actually possible? And what I'm after here is not a lot of rational thought, just kind of what your gut response was. Okay, now, please take another step with me, because what we believe is very important to what we can achieve. We need to know this group's assessment. So each of you think about your response. How many of you thought it's a great idea, but it's not possible? Would you please put up your hands and be honest? Did everybody take a look around? That's very good. Okay. How many of you feel it might be hard to do, but if we wanted to, we could really change? In all the times I have given this talk, in only one other group, only one, did a small minority agree that it was possible. The vast majority of people that I have met do not think so. And that skepticism is the single biggest hurdle to ending war, because if you don't believe it's possible, then it's not possible. Now, the fact is that the root of our problem does lie in our biology, particularly male biology. And because if we had the temperament of lambs or butterflies or bunny rabbits, we wouldn't have it in us to make war. So what is it about us that produces this behavior? Here's an important heads up to remember. In my comments on biology, I'm not referring to individual differences, but to statistically significant differences between males and females in general. I want you to try not to get hung up on what you know about specific women or men that you've read about, for example. And keeping in mind that in humans, virtually all behaviors generally overlap the two sexes. So we begin our search into human nature with two books of the anthropologist Sarah Hrdy. Sarah is a master at synthesizing literature from a wide variety of fields and giving us a fresh perspective. And the first is Mother Nature, a history of mothers, infants, and natural selection. And the takeaway message I stress is that Hrdy dismantles here the idea that women are made of sugar and spice and everything nice, and that men are the less delightful, made from snips and snails and puppy dog tails. Okay? She makes it very clear that women are aggressive beings, that they form dominance hierarchies and they defend them, although not usually with physical violence. And most remarkably, she notes that women under a wide variety of social and physical pressures will abandon or even kill their offspring, which is something we virtually never see in other primate females. Furthermore, men in many cultures care for their children, and men who bond early with their children can be very nurturing. So we're going to begin by dismissing any idea that women are nicer or more nurturing than men. If in the search to understand the capacity for peace or war, we find differences in how men and women use physical aggression, and we will find differences, It's not going to be because women are sugar and spice and men aren't. Now, her most recent work is Mothers and Others on the Origins of Mutual Understanding. Here is a compelling explanation for why humans are cooperative, altruistic, and capable of empathy. Empathy allows us to identify with others, to in some sense feel what they are feeling, and to understand emotionally where they're coming from. To quote Herdy, "No other ape is nearly so good at guessing what others want, or is eager to understand why they want it. We express spontaneous urges to share, and we are routinely eager to help." Her work is cutting edge because her fresh explanation for how cooperation evolved differs from the two most accepted previous explanations, the man the hunter and the man the warrior models. Those models argue that the need for men to hunt big game or to make war in order to acquire essential resources required cooperation. This created sufficient pressure on our species that we became ever more cooperative. Herdy first questions the evolutionary logic here, pointing out that if ever better cooperation was good for either hunting or war, it begs the question, where did the capacity for cooperation come from in the first place? So can we ever know the truth from that very, very distant past? No, it's very unlikely. But I present Herdy's work because I personally find it very compelling, and I'm going to give you some basics from it. Herdy surveys the animal kingdom looking for cooperative breeders. These are species with alloparental assistance in both the care and provisioning of young. In layman's terms, alloparental care means that individuals other than the parental mother and father share in caring for and provisioning offspring that aren't their own. These alloparents are the others in her book's title. The care provided can include guarding or carrying or just general babysitting. Provisioning, however, means just that. They supply food. What cooperative breeding does not mean is that relationships within the group are necessarily harmonious. Far from it. For example, in these spotted hyenas, only the dominant female breeds, and she kills the young of any other female that tries to breed. What is key is that these are species that live in groups, and they share in the care of the young. Now, since we're focusing on human biology, we need to keep in mind two facts about us. We are mammals because our females supply their offspring with milk from mammary glands, and we are primates, closely related to orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. Other primates that are less closely related to us are baboons, monkeys, lemurs, and even more distantly, tiny little cousins called marmosets and tamarins. Among primates, there is a continuum from strictly maternal care of offspring to genuinely cooperative breeding. About 50% of some 276 species of primates show some alloparental care, but in only 20% do they show any food provisioning. And the only fully fledged cooperative breeding primates besides ourselves are from a family called Callitrichidae. These are the tiny, they're almost squirrel-like tamarins and marmosets. The human hand at the upper left-hand corner here gives you an idea of how small they are. In her chapter entitled Why It Takes a Village, Herdy starts building her case that we actually evolved from a previous species, probably Homo erectus, that was already a cooperative breeder. She develops the argument from several angles. First, she points out ways in which our infant care is very unlike that of our close great ape relatives, the gorillas and chimps and so on. The two differences are very striking. First, that human mothers will let someone other than themselves hold and care for their child. Even in the hours right after childbirth, she'll let someone else, the midwife, the grandmother, or so on, hold her child. No great ape mother will let anyone other than herself touch her infant, let alone hold it. And second, human alloparents will give food to babies and children. The cross-cultural studies show that people like grandmothers and aunts will masticate food and then feed it to babies or children. Food provisioning is never seen in the other great apes. So these fundamental child-rearing behaviors, these big differences strongly suggest that our ancestors might have been very different from what we see in our closest primate relatives. So if we're different, why? She continues making her case by comparing traits shared by the little callitrichid cooperative breeders and humans. Looking first at point 5, she describes traits babies have that are crucial to their ability to attract alloparental care. And I'm going to mention 2. First, when touched or spoken to, our babies smile. Many studies show that smiling babies bond better with their mothers, and they positively engage the attention of adults. Our babies can also, very early on, they look for eyes. They follow gazes, especially kind of feminine and pretty ones. Hurdy makes a convincing argument that the development of bonds between these helpless babies and their parents and their critical caregivers would have put major adaptive benefit and pressure on ever more sophisticated cooperation and empathy. To know when an interaction is going well and when it's not going well. Basically, learning how to please others becomes crucial to survival. So this essential caregiving need would have given a big adaptive boost to any latent empathetic or cooperation tendencies. Now we move to point 4, the fact that female callitrichids and humans will sometimes abandon or even kill infants. When you look for some possible explanation for what seems to be an inexplicable behavior, the commonality that emerges is that they do this often within the first 72 hours of birth, when they detect that sufficient resources, including alloparental care, is not going to be available. Putting it very coldly, natural selection has shaped these females to cut their losses quickly because alloparental care is essential for successful child rearing. So this is another human trait strongly suggesting that we evolved from a cooperatively breeding species. We've already covered point number 3, which brings us to points 2 and 1. Something we share with virtually all cooperative breeders is that compared to other species in a particular biological group, cooperative breeders breed faster and they are fast colonizers. Both of these are major competitive advantages. Under natural conditions, humans breed faster than the other apes. The orangutan birth interval is about 8 years. The average across all great apes is 6 years. Humans, who of all the apes produce the largest, slowest maturing, and most costly babies, nevertheless breed the fastest at roughly 3 to 4 year intervals. And of course, everybody knows we have relatively rapidly colonized this entire planet. So why did we initially evolve to cooperate? Was it to facilitate group hunting of big game? Or was it to make war? Or was it to provide essential care to very helpless offspring while speeding up our rate of reproduction and the ability to colonize? To quote Hurdy, without alloparents, there would never have been a human species. And for us, to care and to share is to survive. We may not be able to prove that the origins of cooperation and empathy do not lie in making war. But at the very least, Hurdy's is a compelling hypothesis for the origins and subsequent elaboration of cooperation and empathy that does not depend on either hunting or killing each other. I'm going to quote Hurdy again regarding the possibility of intergroup conflicts and the origins of war. This is a kind of long quote. Small bands of hunter-gatherers numbering 25 or so individuals under conditions of chronic climate fluctuations, widely dispersed over large areas, unable to fall back on staple foods like sweet potatoes or manioc, would have suffered high rates of mortality, particularly child mortality, due to starvation as well as predation and disease. Recurring population crashes and bottlenecks were likely, resulting in difficulty recruiting sufficient numbers. Far from being competitors for resources, nearby members of their own species would have been more valuable as potential sharing partners. When conflicts did loom, moving on would have been more practical as well as less risky than fighting. Hurdy also touches on the subject of altruism. A definition of altruism is hard to come by and hasn't really been settled on completely, but a working definition for our purposes is the principle or practice of unselfish concern or devotion to the welfare of others, helping even if you have no guarantee that you'll be helped in return. Okay. Hurdy describes laboratory experiments by Judith Burkhart's team in which marmosets were caged side by side. If subject A pulled a cord, food was delivered to A and to the neighbor B. And females in breeding condition were inclined to do this for subject B. It's an example of altruism. Females that weren't in breeding condition, but they were in a group that had young, were inclined to give food to subject B. Note, however, that if they were not in breeding condition or the group had no young, they showed no interest in such caring behavior. So, hormonal state and social condition makes the altruism conditional. However, there it is. We're now going to turn to the primatologist Frans de Waal, and he began his work with chimpanzees. Chimpanzee Politics, Power and Sex Among Apes, is a fascinating book to read. He looked at his captive chimps as individuals with political and social agendas, and the chief male agenda being dominance. And he reported something not reported before, that after a big fight between rival males, a key to maintaining group cohesion was a process he called reconciliation. The combatants would spend time with the subordinate grooming the dominant and the dominant allowing it. And reconciliation is now a widely recognized process. After two warring human parties end a war, if there is to be any going forward with group cohesion, they need to go through a reconciliation process. Now, given my interest in gender differences, I noted that that it was often one of the female chimps that would instigate the reconciliation between the fighting males. So, when considering the human potential for peace, we too have the capacity to reconcile, which obviously is not unique to humans. Working with colleagues, de Waal also explores the roots of morality, a sense of fairness and what's right and what's wrong. And obviously, this has major implications for war and peace. Some fascinating studies involve another primate, not very closely related to us, the little tiny Capuchin monkeys, sometimes called organ grinder monkeys. Using cages similar to the ones Burkhart's team used with the marmosets, the investigators used tokens and food rewards to detect any willingness to share. Now think about it. If during the evolution of cooperation, it probably would have been critical for individuals to compare their efforts and payoffs with those of others. If you are caring and sharing and the other guy isn't, you need to be able to detect that and adjust your behavior accordingly. And the fancy phrase for this is aversion to inequity. De Waal and his collaborators set up a situation where monkeys in side-by-side cages could see everything that was happening. And then they learned to exchange a stone token for a piece of food, either a grape or a slice of cucumber. Now, for Capuchins, grapes are a delicacy, and cucumber is just okay, but they will happily exchange a token for cucumber. But if subject A observes that subject B was handed a grape for her token, subject A was reluctant to exchange hers for a mere cucumber. And if B was given a grape without even having to give up a token, A either tossed her token at the researcher or out of the chamber or absolutely refused to accept the cucumber slice. So in human terms, we would say, this just was not fair. And many similar experiments with capuchins and other species give a similar result. A sense of fairness apparently is critical in group living species where cooperation might leave you open to unfair advantage or cheating. And how does that relate to the potential for peace? Later on, I'll mention two complementary kinds of actions that could be used in a campaign to end war. One of these is nonviolent civil disobedience, and a lot of actions qualify, from marches to boycotts to sit-ins to strikes. Some of you may have participated in those kinds of things. The protesters in Egypt's Tahrir Square used nonviolent civil disobedience. The success of the nonviolent actions depends upon a shared innate sense of morality and justice. The protests are most effective when they are directed against something that humans all know in their hearts is wrong. What are some famous examples of these things that people know in their hearts? Examples are slavery, domination of a people by a foreign power, domination of people through force, the denial of rights to people because of their skin color or sex or even their religion. De Waal explores the origins of morality in this book, Primates and Philosophers. And his work and that of others is supporting the view that the roots of human morality are very ancient. A shared sense of what is fair and what is right and what is wrong is also part of what kind of animal we are. Exactly what is considered fair frequently differs in different cultures. But there are some universals, and one of these is that it is wrong to kill another human being. A campaign to end war would draw heavily on that built-in moral universal. We now come to the issue of the origins of war itself. Is it an evolved trait, like our urges to care and share, and our sense of fairness? Something so deep in our DNA that it is virtually inescapable. The answer to the questions will directly depend on our potential for peace, because what we think about our origins and what we think about ourselves is critical to how we perceive what we're able to do, whether we think we could end war or not. And this brings me to the anthropologist Douglas Fry and his two books, The Human Potential for Peace and Beyond War. In The Human Potential for Peace, Fry presents a massive review of cross-cultural literature on violence. He's going right back to his predecessors' original ethnographies. These are fieldwork studies across hundreds of cultures on the globe. He was looking particularly at traditional and nomadic cultures. And the reason is that those people would be living most like our ancestors from the deep past. He reread these studies and the conclusions drawn from them from a slightly new perspective, namely that perhaps we have not always made war. And his thinking was that if his predecessors held the common view that we have always made war, then they might very well have been looking for and finding signs of war when in fact there was no war. His reanalysis especially focused on many different aspects of living in 35 hunter-gatherer cultures, and he spotted something very interesting. This table lists 8 variables down the left-hand side and compares them between simple hunter-gatherers and complex hunter-gatherers. All of these cultures are using hunter-gatherer technology. But if we look at mobility, the simple hunter-gatherer cultures were nomadic or semi-nomadic, while the complex hunter-gatherers had found a food resource sufficiently rich and stable that they could settle down. The classic example of settled hunter-gatherers are the Indian cultures along the Pacific Northwest of the United States that depended on massive salmon runs. Fry separated out the nomadic hunter-gatherers from those that had settled, and tabled in this table are the remarkable differences that emerged. Look at warfare on the bottom here. And note that nomadic, simple hunter-gatherers, who arguably most resemble our ancient ancestors, rarely make war, while settled ones commonly do. If you don't separate the nomadic from the settled groups, the patterns aren't detectable. And previous analyses had not made this separation. And look at political system. The simple hunter-gatherer political system is egalitarian, not hierarchical, and that includes women. Women in hunter-gatherer societies that are nomadic have equal status with men. If you accept that the nomadic hunter-gatherers are probably our best window into our deep, deep past, then most likely we did not always make war. There are other experts who still favor the man-the-warrior model. Notable examples are Lawrence Keeley, who wrote War Before Civilization, and the Harvard anthropologist Richard Wrangham, who wrote Demonic Males, Apes, and the Origins of Human Violence. In his second book, Beyond War, Fry challenges these and other experts that hold that theory. Fry also looked at the fossil evidence for war, and he concludes that there is none before about 15,000 years ago. And given that our lineage goes back roughly 200,000 years, 15,000 makes war a very recent thing. It seems that settling down around a reliable resource changes the rules for living in a way that fosters the emergence of a number of things, including war. And of course, we settled down big time, beginning roughly 10,000 years ago on the advent of the agricultural revolution. War seems to be something that emerged not from a built-in genetic biological imperative, but as the result of putting our hunter-gatherers into a new environment. I think of war as one of the many unfortunate, unintended consequences of the agricultural revolution, right along with the development of lots of tooth decay and shorter physical stature, which you can see clearly in the fossil record. Also the loss of status of women, and most recently, obesity from overindulgence in sweets. While war is not hardwired in us, some of the traits that we have are, and we now move to my work, which is to consider what those traits are. You can look for the causes of war in modern humans at more than one level. There are psychological causes. We can try to figure out the driving motivations of leaders who get us into wars, what's making them tick. However, I don't look at the psychology of why some folks start a war. You can also look for the immediate or proximal causes of war. What do the people fight over? Things like oil and gold, diamonds, territory, and so on. And that would be the subject for another talk. That is also not, however, the area of study that I concentrate on. My specialty is biology. I study what are called the ultimate causes of war, the biological roots of the behavior, and most especially I focus on gender differences. Nearly everyone has the sense that women and men are different when it comes to using physical aggression to resolve differences. But why? And what happens when women are essentially not included in the decision-making? As it turns out, during the evolution of our ancestors, probably cooperative breeders, males and females experienced different reproductive pressures. They have what biologists call different reproductive priorities. These different biological pressures and priorities created over time significant differences in general between men and women in their response to social conflicts and how to resolve them. My book explores the biological perspective that's the backbone of my work, and to follow the logic, keep in mind we are mammals and primates. So here's the basic biological argument for why men and women differ with respect to social conflict and physical aggression. Number one, the basic biological bottom line for all living things is to reproduce and have offspring that also reproduce. If you don't reproduce, your genes are not passed on. I didn't have children, so my genes will not be passed on. Number two, for female mammals, and certainly for female primates, reproducing is a very expensive proposition in time, risks taken, and energy expenditure. Female primates carry their offspring to term, nourishing it within their body, often for months, and then they risk the hazards of childbirth. Then they have to provide milk for nourishment. Then they must protect it, care for it, and support it, often for years, before it is old enough to reproduce. And if you had children, you can perhaps relate to that monumental effort. And then, after their offspring reproduce, cooperatively breeding human females are still deeply involved in most cultures in ensuring that the offspring of their offspring also survive, their grandchildren. This is unquestionably for females a very extended, risky, and expensive process. Therefore, the ideal situation for female primates is social stability for long periods. Anything that threatens the life of these expensive offspring or their caregiver, certainly war, is hugely counterproductive for females. Many traits characteristic of how women respond to conflicts are a reflection of this evolved traits for social stability. For example, women in general are more naturally inclined to compromise, to negotiate. And it's a fact that solutions arrived at by those means, which usually result in what's called a win-win outcome, are more stable. Note, however, that if women can be convinced that they, their children, or their community is under some kind of mortal threat, they will encourage the men to make preemptive war. They will even fight themselves. Women can be fierce defenders of children and community. It's just that for women, fighting is a last resort. Now, for male mammals, including male primates, the biological game is quite different because males never, ever invest as much as females do. In some primates, the fathers invest nothing but sperm. Human fathers often become involved in some support and care of their offspring, but it's not true of all cultures, and it never approaches a female's investment. A male priority has been to spread their seed as widely as possible. So, should they lose an offspring, they also have the potential to relatively easily father another one. Therefore, for many male primates, including men, social stability is not as high a priority as it is for females. Indeed, for our males, the urge to rise in dominant status is a primary driver. And higher dominance does generally correlate with greater reproductive success. Much of men's social lives is focused on rearranging the social order in order to achieve greater dominance. And sometimes this involves using physical violence. So as a consequence, men in general are more naturally inclined to physical win-lose behavior. I win, you lose, I therefore have gained status. The cultural anthropologist Christopher Boehm wrote Hierarchy in the Forest, the Evolution of Egalitarian Behavior. And it includes examples of life within nomadic tribes in Africa. And the observation most relevant to what we're talking about is how hard these egalitarian and nonviolent cultures work to make sure that no upstart males or females, but mostly males, do not assert themselves in ways that would increase their dominance. At a minimum, they're ridiculed. If a hunter brags about what a huge gazelle he brought down, a woman might laugh and point out, well, how fortunate for him, because mostly what you bring in is so puny. If the ridicule doesn't suffice, would-be upstarts can be sanctioned by shunning or even ostracism. These folks also teach nonviolent conflict resolution, even conflict avoidance, and equality to their children from the very beginning. We have inherited from our primate ancestors the urge to form dominance hierarchies. And if a community is to remain egalitarian, any such tendencies for domination have to be nipped in the bud. This male urge for dominance does lie behind many efforts to build and deploy armies. Another characteristically male trait that can be used to build an army is aggressive male bonding. Certainly, it has always facilitated protecting a group of humans from predation. It's also crucial to certain kinds of hunting. And we see the tendency expressed in a male love of aggressive team sports, in young males that bond together to do Halloween pranks like draping a neighbor's yard with toilet paper, and when angry men form a mob after a stolen election or even after a soccer match. It's highly unlikely that these mobs will be composed mostly of women. Another trait, actually a very admirable trait, but one that can be used to facilitate building an army, is the willingness to protect the group even at the risk of one's life. A clever manipulator will assert that our group must be protected from some evil other group, that unless the men act, women and children are in danger, our way of life is in danger, Most men find it very hard to resist and let other men go do the fighting, the risk-taking, and the dying while they just stand by. I want to stress again here that I'm not talking about individual differences. This is a reminder. Some women are very aggressive, even violent. Some men are gentle as lambs. The issue is statistical differences between men and women. We're talking numbers here. A general male biology operating with respect to war virtually unrestrained for millennia from any meaningful female input. Here for fun, I symbolically represented the men's vote on whether to go to war now or negotiate some more. Note the symbolic percentages of yeas and nays. It's not that all men would favor war. Compare that to a corresponding hypothetical women's vote. It's not that all women would vote against leaping into war, just that the greater percentage of them would. We have 9 votes for war and 11 for negotiating a bit longer. Giving women the vote adds a significant restraining influence. The fundamental difference here is why if women were partners with men in our governing bodies, the world would grow more socially stable, and once in that condition, would be better able to maintain it. And I need to stress something now. Note the intertwined male and female symbols. It's gender partnership that can give us what we need to end war. Because we're going to need to make major changes in the social order. Women alone can't end war, but neither can men alone. We're going to have gender partnership. This painting is attributed to Goya, and it depicts people fleeing from the colossus of war. Most men abhor war. That is actually killing other people. Even what we call alpha males, say JFK or the U2 singer Bono, Brad Pitt, Paul Newman. I love alpha males because they're the heroes of the novels that I write. But men I call hyper alpha males are different. They're out of control males. They are unconstrained by their culture or their women. They seek to dominate all others, whether in a small tribal world or a world that spans continents. And they are willing to kill to do it. They are the generators of wars, the warmongers. They kill or have others kill for them. I assure you that we have modern versions of these hyper-alpha men on all sides of our current conflicts. And by the way, I would guess that the percentage of hyper-alpha men in all our populations, the warmongers, is maybe 10%. They are a tail that has been wagging the dog for way too long. Simply put, we need to learn to identify them, leash them, and muzzle them before they lead us into wars. Now, that's our look at biology of war and gender differences. Now we're going to consider why we can embrace the goal of ending war with confidence. First, the fact that nonviolent cultures exist. Many live without war. They are incontrovertible proof that war is not genetically built into us. The red dots indicate the centers of distribution of over 80 such cultures. Now, these are not utopias, but any kind of physical aggression, things like pushing or shoving, are not observed here. That's very rare. And you know some of their names: the Amish, the Hopi, Laplanders or Sami, and Fry even includes the Norwegians now. Most of their names are totally unfamiliar to us. They are not taught in our schools. And sometimes I think it's almost like the dominant warring cultures would like to keep them a secret lest we get revolutionary ideas. You can find information about these cultures in this website, peacefulsocieties.org, and of course in Doug Fry's books. A second reason why we can be hopeful, even confident, that we can shape a major paradigm shift is because our time in history is crucially different from people who preceded us who would have liked to have ended war. Remarkable events have given us an open time window of opportunity. And I personally fear, however, that it's a very narrow window. There are some very ominous changes coming at us. But it is a narrow window of opportunity nevertheless. This series of monumental changes began roughly 700 years ago. The first brought the Enlightenment. the Renaissance and the Reformation. They encouraged persons to think for themselves, beginning with their relationship to the divine. The individual came to be viewed as something of worth, not just an obedient tool or a possession of the king or of the state. The next was the introduction of the modern scientific method, beginning roughly 350 years ago. This way to search out truth gave us ologists, primatologists, zoologists, anthropologists, and so on. The work of thousands of people in these intervening 300-some-odd years have allowed us to figure out what kind of animal we are. We know why we make war, and we know the role of both genders play. The third was the return to the ideal of democratic government. This allows the people, not just kings or tyrants, to decide to make war or not. And especially important in a modern democracy, the votes of women equal men's. We are all, for example, certainly holding our breath that the Egyptians transition into a genuine democracy, and I would stress one that includes women as equals, if they're going to make any real progress. Fourth was the vote for women. It only began roughly 100 years ago that women started getting the vote, and we now have powerful women leading up NGOs, businesses, and even governments. This change in women's social status depends to a great extent on women having readily access to reliable family planning. And finally, we have the birth of the internet. This incredible tool allows us to foster global connectedness in ways we could not have imagined not even 10 years ago. We have recently seen its power for the Egyptians and all over the Middle East. Literally hundreds of thousands before us have worked, and many have died, to bring us to this opportune moment. Our time is absolutely different. The challenge for us is to rise to the opportunity, to seize the day. So we're poised to change, but what could give us encouragement that we can change rapidly? Or would it take many generations and hundreds of years? Hardly worth any pressing effort right now because we're all busy. I'm going to mention 3 examples of our capacity to create rapid change. First, an easy change. In the U.S. in the late 1800s and the early 20th centuries, people, mostly men, chewed tobacco. And public places like bars and railroad cars and offices provided spittoons. After the 1918 flu epidemic, this habit came into disfavor and it died out. Here's a shaped change on a larger scale. For 10 centuries in China, the very definition of feminine beauty depended on a woman's feet being extremely small, no more than 3 inches. For all practical purposes, these women could not walk. In 1911, the New Republic of China government banned foot binding. And it was practiced in secret for a while, but now it's defunct. A belief of 1,000 years changed in less than 100. And a compelling example of the speed and profundity with which an enormous change on a huge scale can happen when sufficient financial and human resources are applied is the Christianization by the Catholic and other faith groups of numerous native cultures in South America and elsewhere, often within 1 generation. Many Christian ideas were simply grafted onto the indigenous religions, but many behaviors changed. For example, people adopted more modest clothing, they gave up headhunting, and so on and so on. It is simply wrong to try to argue that we can't shape the future, or that making big changes would take many hundreds of years. It's a matter of deciding to do it and then taking the necessary action. So what's happening right now that can give us confidence in our ability to end war? I'm going to highlight 4 out of hundreds of hopeful signs. First, we have reached a critical mass of women with education, resources, and power. Enough women to make a big difference in our governing priorities, if they can get their act together. And I mean really high-level influence. By historical standards, the rate of change is rapid and accelerating. Even 10 years ago, I would not have been comfortable making this statement about a critical mass of powerful women. But now I am comfortable doing so. At the other end of the power spectrum, one of the greatest sources of confidence is legions of grassroots, women's and peace movements around the globe. And a disproportionate number of these peace movements are instigated and led by women. Globally, the number of such organizations is easily in the tens of thousands. A second sign of change happening right now is the increasing numbers of powerful men like these who have figured out that partnership with women is the key to positive changes. And a third critical mass we've reached is the numbers of organizations not only working for change locally or even nationally, but uniting and thinking globally. And these are the logos of just a few of my favorite organizations. We have many challenges, and so these folks tend to have different concerns. From my perspective, they have a big problem. They haven't found a way to speak with one voice that has sufficient clout to demand an end to war or poverty or any of another host of other ills. Creating a mechanism to make that unity possible is the focus now of my work. I'm trying to put together a global movement to prevent and ultimately to abolish war that would operate using a mechanism already pioneered by the International Committee to Ban Landmines. I call it, for a name, FACE, for all children everywhere. It's a partnership for nonviolence and the prevention of war. Your organization, for example, could be a founding partner. I've explained in detail how FACE would work in an essay entitled Shaping the Future for those of you who might be interested. And finally, we come to a successful women's movement that demanded and won peace for their people. How many of you have seen the documentary film Pray the Devil Back to Hell? Well, the rest of you should. Do rent it and see it. In 2003, after over 8 years of a brutal civil war in the West African country of Liberia, Christian and Muslim women banded together. They used nonviolent tactics to pressure the fighting factions to make peace. What the Liberian women did and what they are doing as I am speaking to you is both a metaphor and a model for the kind of social transformation campaign that I have in mind. There was a movement to end the British slave trade. There was a movement to give women the vote. There was a movement to end segregation in the U.S. South. There was a movement to end apartheid in South Africa. I'm saying I believe it's time for a global movement to prevent and ultimately abolish the brutal, brutal insanity that is war. So now, how do we get from here to there? If a group of leaders, perhaps from this organization, were resolved to do it, what would have to be the basics of the components of their campaign? Happily, the principles of successful, nonviolent social transformation have already been worked out. I love the example of the U.S. suffragettes, but the person who arguably wrote the most prolifically was Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi's efforts to pressure the British to grant India independence can be divided into what he called constructive program and what others have called obstructive program. Constructive program efforts are good works that people do to prepare the ground for the transformed future they are creating. Gandhi's constructive programs were things like teaching villagers to be self-reliant and independent and working to get rid of the worst abuses of the caste system. In the case of ending war, I grouped the many necessary good works into what I call cornerstones, 9 of them. Examples of constructive program for our time and for ending war would be teaching peace, ending poverty, providing health care and education, creating a sustainable economic system, and so on. If we examine advanced aspects of planning and history, however, it becomes very evident that good works, while necessary, aren't sufficient to force a major social transformative change. To dismantle the massive war machine, a machine that's been going on for ages, the plan also must use obstructive program, the tactics of nonviolent civil disobedience and direct action. And these rely for success in no small part on an innate sense of justice and fairness. And in an essay called To Abolish War, which is on my website if you're interested, I compare the roles of constructive and obstructive programs. So we're going to need leaders to devise the plan and direct the action. And these are a few of the notable founding fathers of the USA. These were visionary men. A movement to prevent and ultimately to abolish war also needs founding mothers and fathers. We're going to need to put new faces in frames for our time and for our need. Leaders who resolve to bend the arc of history toward nonviolence. The persons who are inclined to take up this cause are going to have to seek out others like them. They have to believe the cause is worthy of their lives, and maybe even if they have it, a portion of their fortune. They need to find a place to meet, to make plans. Perhaps they would form an ending war working group at the United Nations. Or they might be hosted by a premier peace institute or a coalition of several institutions. They will certainly need to be savvy users of all possible media to get the word out. Ending war is possible. We're going to make it happen. We have a plan. We're succeeding. Join us. They will need to be not only quarterbacks of this campaign, but its cheerleaders. Now, at this point, we're nearing the end of my time, and I hope that you are thinking, so what could I do? It's big project. What could I do? The first thing is very simple and doesn't require time or money. Tell people that you know that preventing and ending war is actually possible if we want it. And you join the people who are saying, you know, enough is enough, it's over. The flower children of the 1960s wanted to end war. In fact, some of you might have been among those flower children. But they didn't know how to do it. But the flower children did know one true thing. If you're not a part of the solution, you are a part of the problem. You can find an organization that's doing either constructive or obstructive program, something that suits your temperament and personality and your talents, and join it. The truth is, this is actually a great moment for humanity because our world crises call out for us to act. The question is, will we rise to the occasion? There's a story about John Newton, who was the ship's captain who was a slave trader, who later in his life as a minister wrote the supremely powerful hymn, Amazing Grace. And it's said that on his last trip he repented. He realized that what he was doing was a sin. And he didn't complete the voyage. He turned around, and he's quoted as saying, "It's never too late to turn the boat around." So we do have within us a tremendous potential for peace. And as full partners, men and women can shape a less violent, more egalitarian, just, and even ecologically sustainable future. A good place for our children and the children to follow them. I think it would be wonderful if in the future it would be said of our generation that we saw that what we were doing was wrong and that we knew that we could do better and that we joined forces and shaped a better destiny for those to come after us. And I do have one last image to share with you. This is the ideal response of the people of the world to any leader or leaders calling for war. As I said at the beginning, I have presented this. These are key ideas painted in very broad strokes, and so I'm going to be happy now to try and answer some of your questions. And of course, I invite you to go to my AFWW website where much of this is covered. So, do we have any questions here? 1,000, yes. Okay, let's start right here with Sam.
My question is specifically about your 9 cornerstones. You mentioned 3 of them on what came up on the screen. I'm wondering if population control is one of those 9.
It's not one of the 9. Actually, that's an interesting question that I always get because it is critical. But the 9 cornerstones are very, very broad categories. For example, one is empower women. If you empower women, one of the things that happens right away is what's called a demographic transition. They stop having so many babies. So I didn't feel I needed another cornerstone to elaborate on what is true about empowering women. And moreover, there's another cornerstone called ensure essential resources. And that includes things like health care. If you give women access to reproductive health care and reproductive planning, that will bring down the birth rate. So again, it's encompassed, that concept is encompassed in some of the other cornerstones. Because I repeat the question. The question was, do I have a cornerstone for population control? That was the question. Another question. Yes, what you're referring to is, if all you didn't hear, it's called freedom.
Just put that out last night.
Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders, KPBS, and so on. It's about the civil rights movement, which is a classic case to study if you want to know how to bring about social transformation on a grand scale using nonviolent methods. Thank you. Now, what's interesting, and they were successful. I want to tell you why they were successful. It's because they didn't shoot from the hip. The people in the South who wanted to end segregation, there were already people working on this idea, we want to end segregation, and they did two very smart things. First of all, they went to Martin Luther King. He did not start that movement. They went to Martin Luther King and said, Martin, we have to have a voice. We have to have a face. We have to have a representative. That is one of the important principles for this campaign that I have in mind, FACE. What I need to start with is 5 luminaries. 5 really famous, globally famous people who buy into this and say, yes, I will give my life to this cause. Because without a voice, without that, the media has no place to go, people aren't attracted, followers are not attracted, and so on. So one of the first things they did was go to a man who was a powerful speaker and say to him, we need you. And another smart thing they did was they invited people over from India who had worked with Gandhi, who knew how to mount a campaign, a planned campaign. It was not just that they said, okay, let's just go and demonstrate here. They had these people come over. They learned from them how to be nonviolent. One of the interesting things is the excessive training it takes to teach men who will be involved to not respond aggressively when they are struck and hit and so on. One of the interesting things about putting women on the front lines, which is one of my suggestions, by the way, is that you don't have to train women to not turn violent right away. That is their natural inclination to begin with. So that movement, again, success. If you look at the other movements that were successful, and there's another man named Gene Sharp who has written about nonviolent direct action, or what he calls nonviolent struggle. There are hundreds of such examples, but the ones that were successful are the ones that were planned. They were just not higgly-piggly. Because what's happening in Egypt now is a perfect example. It wasn't exactly planned, although I think there was more planning behind it than we might be aware. There was some training. There were some people that had been over there talking to them about how to do nonviolent social transformation. But there's no plan for afterwards. You have to have planned in advance. What are your strategy? What are your tactics? Where are you going? Where is the weak place of the war machine? You don't want to just start protesting war in general. This is going to get you nowhere, because there are very definite rules about how to take on an ill or an evil. You have to find its weak points and then direct your campaign to those weak points. So there is much more behind all of this. But studying something like the Freedom Riders would be a really good place to start getting that education. One of the things I worry about in the United States is that since we don't have a draft anymore, we have been sort of tamed. We thought we won big time when we got rid of the draft. We have a volunteer army, and moreover, we're hiring mercenaries. So the war system is finding a way to co-opt us and to keep the war machine. The war machine is really a money-making machine, is what it is. And they found several ways to get around this. Because if you had young people being drafted to go to these wars, then you would have people really motivated. And some of them would be willing to use nonviolence. That's why I'm thinking that the kind of movement I have in mind is likely to emerge most forcefully in places like Africa or maybe Asia, where women are gaining some power and so on, and where they are hurting. If you watch the film, a film that I would recommend to you and to all of you is Pray the Devil Back to Hell, because there's one very touching vignette in that when the women are deciding that they're going to have to go out and demonstrate nonviolently without weapons, And their families are telling them, this is dangerous. You could be hurt, or you could be taken to jail. You know, who knows what will happen to you. You're a mother, you have children. You can't do this. You shouldn't do this. And one woman says, no, I have to do this because their war was so bad that she felt she was already dead. It's when people get to that point where they say, I will do this no matter what. You can hit me, you can send me to jail, whatever. If it's well planned, usually it doesn't come to actually people losing their lives. Losing their lives often happens when you have people trying to do a nonviolent demonstration against the wrong kind of odds. The general, the planners haven't picked the field. They haven't picked the situation properly, and people start getting killed. So you can do nonviolent protests, but usually the people have to be, as you point out, they have to finally come to the point and say, I'm willing to do this, whatever it takes. Anne.
As this woman mentioned last night in that program, a woman was asked by a reporter, aren't you afraid you'll be killed? And she said, well, we all wrote our wills last night, so
we're ready to go.
We're ready to go. Our wills are signed and we're here.
That's amazing, is it not? They had actually gone ahead and written their wills.
We realize how dangerous it is, you know?
Yes, yes.
I thought it would be fun to just start saying all the time, war is so 20th century.
Yes! Yes!
Yesterday.
I love it. That's good media use. That would be great media use. Yes, indeed.